بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So inshallah in today's lecture we are going to continue the discussion of the Meccan and the Medina verses. We did the Meccan verses, we talked a little bit about that. So now what's left for us to do is to talk about the verses of Medina. And we're going to learn about some of the broad themes or the broad styles that we find in the Medinese verses, similar to what we did with the Meccan verses. And then moving from that, we are going to look at a comparison between the Meccan verses and the Medinese verses in the style, the language style that you find in the verses. Are the verses long? Are the verses short? Are the verses metaphoric? Are the verses more literal? Etc. That also is one of the areas that the ulama like to look at in comparing both the Meccan and the Medinese verses. That will take us to the end of the chapter, to the end of the current chapter that we're in. Following that, we will begin chapter 8, which is a discussion of tafsir. So when we come to talk about tafsir, we will learn that there are, first of all, we will define what tafsir is, and then we will learn that there are two types of tafsir. There's tafsir al-ma'thur and tafsir bil-ra'i. There's the tafsir based on documenting what narrations are narrated related to specific verses and stories. And then there is the tafsir of the ra'i, in which the ulama engage in independent thinking to derive rules. In today's lecture, we are only going to talk about tafsir al-ma'thur, and the Shaykh is going to give us the list of about 4 or 5 of the top tafsirs in this category. And what we're going to do for the rest of the class is we're going to look at the authors of those tafsir and look a little bit about their tafsirs and why they are unique and why they are important. In the process of doing that, we are going to come to learn of some of the challenges that have happened in the tafsir literature. So we will look at the concept of Isra'iliyat, narrations that come from the people of the book that have seeped their way into the tafsir. Sometimes they're sound, sometimes they're not sound. And we'll also talk about the fact that over time, a lot of the chains of transmissions of these narrations were dropped. So when we come to a lot of the earlier books of tafsir bil-ma'thur, we don't have a lot of accurate commentaries, which creates a problem in the tafsir literature. So we're going to talk about that as well. These are the main topics. I'll see you back inshallah for the next clip. Alright, so let us pick up where we left off, which is now to talk about the verses that were revealed at the time of Medina, vis-a-vis their discussion. What are the themes that they usually discuss? Number one is, you will typically find in the verses revealed in the Medina verses is that they deal with the specifics of the Sharia. They'll talk about the specifics of acts of worship, of the prayer, of tahara, of zakah, hajj, certain types of transactions, business transactions, things related to money, marriage and divorce, wet nursing, and punishments that are associated with different crimes, right? So the specifics, basically, of the Sharia. In the Meccan verses, it was more broad. When it came to issues of the Sharia, it was more about establishing correct belief and theology. The Medina verses are the ones that get into those type of details. Number two is, a lot of the Medina verses start to address the da'wah to the people of the book, specifically the Jews and the Christians, because it was after the hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ from Mecca to Medina that he starts to interact with people of the book in a very direct way, especially the Jews, because there were about 19 or 20 Jewish tribes in Medina when the Prophet ﷺ migrated. So you'll find a lot of verses dealing with the interaction between the two and adducing proofs and arguments for the veracity of our narration of certain stories of pre-Islamic prophets. Number three is, you will find in the Medina verses a description of the hypocrites, the munafiqun, because again, this was unfortunately one of the main problems that the Prophet ﷺ had to deal with when he went to Medina. Is a new element emerge in society called the hypocrites. So we'll find a lot of verses that talk about that. And then lastly, we have the verses that talk about our relationship with other peoples and other nations and other powers. And these are the verses that talk about as-siyasatu shar'iyya, or Islamic governance, the beginnings of Islamic governance, and issues related to warfare, conflict, peace resolution, etc. Right? So these are four of the top kind of themes that you typically find with the verses of the Medina verses. Now let us go back and look at the Meccan verses to talk about some of the, and compare and contrast the Meccan verses to the Medinese verses vis-a-vis the style of the verses. Meccan verses tend to be shorter, as do the chapters. This is not a fast rule, by the way. This is just generalization. The verses tend to be shorter, and the chapters tend to be shorter. Number two is you find a lot of stoppages in the verses. The different fusul, the fawasil of the when you read a verse, you have those letters on the top, jim, sili, etc., that you can either stop or go. Recommended to stop, recommended to go, you have to stop, you have to go, etc. So you'll find the Meccan verses tend to have more of those. And number three, a lot of verses, Meccan verses, will be giving examples, confirming meanings, repetition of verses, repetition of meanings. And number four, it paints realistic pictures of the things that will happen in the hereafter. So very vivid descriptions of either punishment in the hereafter, may Allah Ta'ala protect us, or reward in the hereafter. So these four are just some of the styles that you find in the Meccan verses. Now, some of the styles that you find in the Medinese verses is the opposite, is that the verses tend to be longer and the chapters longer, like Al-Baqarah and Al-Imran, which are Medinese chapters and the longest ones in the Quran. And there's a more slower rhythm in the verses and calmer approach because of dealing with some of the legislative issues. Now, he mentions that, and I didn't want to get into this too much because I don't think the treatment of it in the book is comprehensive enough that it warrants us talking about it. So I'll just mention it and then we'll kind of move forward. But he talks about a lot of the Orientalists' attack of the Quran vis-a-vis Meccan and Medinese verses. And the basic argument is that, well, the Prophet ﷺ and his companions were illiterate in Mecca, and that's why the verses are very sort of, fire and brimstone and damnation, that kind of thing. And it wasn't until he went to Medina and he interacted with the people of the book that they took these ideas from the people of the book, and there were more sort of legislation. I mean, that's just a nonsensical, because that's not what the Meccan and the Medinese verses mean. It's about the hijrah as the demarcating point. And there are exceptions to everything that we just said. So, I mean, that argument in itself doesn't hold up. And I'm not an expert on what the Orientalists have said about the Quran, but there are ulama of the Quranic Sciences who have made that their point. And I've actually seen in the bookshops books about that. What did I want to say to conclude this chapter? Okay, knowing the Meccan and Medina verses, the definition of a Meccan verse and a Medinese verse, and some of the differences of style, topics, is important because it gives you a sense of how, when you're reading the Quran, now you have some way of differentiating between one or the other. So I think that has a lot of merit, into it. It's not a proscriptive discussion, it's a descriptive discussion. So it doesn't mean that because the verse is Meccan, it has to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if the verse is a Medina verse, it has to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You shouldn't think of it like that. These are descriptions. This is looking at the verses that we know and the chapters that we know that are Meccan and deducing from it these descriptions that we find. It's not a a completely hard and fast rule. You will find exceptions all over the case, and likewise for the surah verses in the chapters of Medina. Okay, now let us move into chapter 8. We'll talk about tafsir. Basically, tafsir is the Quranic commentaries, exegesis, in which we look at the primary text, the text of the Quran, and seek to comment on it and draw meaning on the verses. Sometimes it's called ta'wil, sometimes it's called tafsir. For the purposes of the class, I'm just going to go with tafsir because that's the common word that we find in our literature. Okay. Now, tafsir is obviously a big deal, right? It's a big deal to take it upon oneself to look at the Quran and Sunnah and to understand it and to expound on it and to draw meanings. So, the scheme of the tafsir we take from Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, who is considered the first and the greatest of the mufassirun, or the greatest of the mufassirin in Islam. And he said, "At-tafsiru arba'atu awjuh." There are four kinds of tafsir. The first one is وجه تعرفه العرب من كلامها. The first one is that you know what the meanings are from the Arabic language. Number two is that tafsir that nobody can claim to be ignorant of. Number three is tafsir that the ulama engage in to explain things. And number four, tafsir that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. So this is an important kind of scheme that Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu leaves for us. The first one is a linguistic tafsir. The language of the Quran is Arabic. إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَاهُ قُرْآنًا عَرَبِيًّا لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ. Allah revealed the Quran in Arabic so that we may know. So for us to understand the language of the Quran, we have to go back to the time of the Jahili Arabs to see how words were used. And that's what a dictionary is, and that's what etymology is. So you can only create a correct understanding of meanings of the Quran by accessing the Arabic of the Quran. Not the modern Arabic, but the Arabic of the Quran. And number two is لا يعذر أحد بجهالته. No one is allowed to claim ignorance of these things. So these are meanings that we understand prima facie from the text, like فَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Things that are just so basic that everybody knows them. And I'll pick up the rest of the list in the next clip, inshallah. So we're in the middle of going through Ibn Abbas's scheme of the four types of tafsir. The first type is a linguistic tafsir. Number two, and that's based on the Arabic language of the Arabs of the time. And number two, some things that nobody can claim ignorance of. We talked about that a little bit. And then number three, the tafsir of the ulama. And this is the ulama explaining in great detail, as we will come to see, the meanings behind things, tying verses together, looking at asbab al-nuzul, looking at the Mecca-Medina thing, using the tools of interpretation of usul al-fiqh. So, putting together all the tools in our toolkit together to derive meanings. And then lastly, the tafsir that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. وَلَا يَعْلَمُ تَفْسِيرُهَا إِلَّا اللَّهُ. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the end of the day knows exactly what it is that He is intended for these things, and all of this is our human attempt to understand the text of the Quran. وَلَا يَعْلَمُ تَأْوِيلُهَا إِلَّا اللَّهُ. Okay, and then those things are like, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَلَى الرُّوحِ قُلْ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُ مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. Those type of the nature of the unseen world that we hear about, but we don't really know the exact nature of it, because that's going to be something that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, or with Him alone. The next thing is that to talk about the two types of tafsir. And as I said in the introductory clip in today's lecture, we're going to take the first type. So there are two types of tafsir in general. Tafsir al-ma'thur and a tafsir bil-ra'i. Tafsir bil-ma'thur or tafsir al-ma'thur is to find narrations, traditions and narrations with chains of transmission about the various verses and the stories in the Quran, and to do the tafsir that way. Okay, there's this verse, I want to find all of the narrations that we have about this topic and about this verse, and I put them here. Next verse, same thing. And then there's a tafsir bil-ra'i, which literally means tafsir by one's opinion, but it's to engage in the ijtihad of the scholars and to use the interpretive toolkit, as I was just mentioning a couple of moments ago, to derive real meanings from the Quran. That's what that tafsir is. So that's what we'll talk about in the next lecture. Now, when it comes to tafsir bil-ma'thur, the Shaykh says that there are three problems that we have. So the tafsir is an area, again, where a lot of people can do work if they're interested in doing work. And alhamdulillah, I have noticed in the last 5-7 years, a lot of critical editions of important tafsir are coming out. So my hunch is that this is something that's happening, and great for it to happen. What are these problems historically? Number one is the injection of the Israeliyat traditions. Number two, a removal of the chains of transmission and documented in tradition. And number three, an occurrence of forgery. So let me explain what those are, because those are pretty major things before we move on to talk about the tafsir that he lists in the book. What are the Israeliyat? What are the traditions of the people of the book? Well, most of the prophets in the Quran that are mentioned are the Hebrew prophets, the prophets that came to Bani Israel. So obviously the text of the Jews is going to have a lot more to say about those prophets than our text. It's as simple as that. So there are a lot of details. What was the name of Moses' mother? What was the name of Moses' sister? Those type of levels of details, we don't necessarily have those type of traditions. And in general, we have no problem accepting those type of details from the people of the book, because it falls under an already established category by the primary text, which is that there's a prophet called Moses and Aaron. And the Prophet ﷺ, he has a hadith that's narrated in Bukhari, بَلِّغُ عَنِّي وَلَوْ آيَةً, narrate upon me or spread my knowledge, even if it's just one verse. وَحَدِّثُ عَنْ بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ وَلَا حَرَجْ, and also narrate from Israel, Bani Israel, the people before you, people of the book before you, there's no problem. وَمَنْ كَذَبَ عَلَيَّ مُتَعَمِّدًا فَلْيَتَبَوَّأْ مَقْعَدَهُ مِنَ النَّارِ, and whoever lies about me on purpose, let them await their chair in the hellfire. May Allah Ta'ala protect us. So the Prophet was very clear. You have the right to look at the sources of the people of the book before you and use them. But there's got to be parameters. You can't just take everything, obviously, because you can't take a verse about Christ, or teaching about Christ being divine, or the Trinity or something like that, and say, oh, well, this is from the people of the book before us. That's not going to work, because that's not compatible with our theology. So what happened is, over time, you have these traditions that come from the previous religious traditions, but without filter. And they come and they create a problem. He does something very nice, which is very useful. I want to do this for you too. He mentions 4 people upon whom it is known to have narrated a lot of these traditions from the people of the book. Abdullah bin Salam, Ka'b al-Ahbar, Wahb ibn Munabbah, and Abdul Malik ibn Abdul Aziz ibn Jurayj, rahimahumullah. So those are people that will have a lot of those traditions. Again, there's nothing wrong with taking those traditions, but you have to take those traditions with conditions. It can't violate a principle of aqeedah, it can't violate a known tradition that we have about an aspect of a story, so on and so forth. And then he says that the chains of transmissions are removed. So a lot of times, because the tafsir is not a book of hadith, a lot of the early mufassirun remove the chain of transmission. And you just say, Ibn Abbas said, and then there's just some tradition. Okay, where is the chain of transmission to Ibn Abbas so we can grade it? Is it sound or is it not sound? So when you have that situation and you have huge, multi-volume tafsir that have all of these type of narrations, then you run the risk of bringing in weaker traditions, unreliable traditions, and since the reader has no way of verifying the veracity of them, you end up bringing in false beliefs, which can create a problem. Okay, so this is one of the things that he mentions that create a problem in these types of tafsir. And then, lastly, he says, unfortunately, forgery, al-wada', that in some of these early tafsir, there are people that forged aspects of traditions and aspects of stories and things like that. And that's why I mentioned a moment ago the modern movement of developing critical editions is very, very significant. Very significant. Now, when it comes to the Isra'iliyat, we have some Isra'iliyat, by the way, that come from the Prophet himself, alayhi salatu wasalam, or narrated by the Sahaba. And then there are those narrations that we know that are false, and then there are those narrations that are in between. We don't know if they're false or not. So one has to follow a certain set of procedures when it comes to those type of traditions specifically to be able to accept them or to not accept them. Okay. Then he lists four tafsirs that are in this category of the tafsir al-ma'thur that we're talking about, that we're going to, kind of go into a little bit of detail with each one of them. First one is Jam' al-Bayan fi Tafsir al-Quran by Tabari, Tabari's tafsir, and then Tafsir al-Quran al-Azim by Ibn Kathir's tafsir, Lubab al-Ta'wil fi Ma'ani Tanzil by al-Khazin, and Al-Jawahir al-Hasan fi Tafsir al-Quran li-Tha'alabi. So these four are excellent representation of this type of tafsir al-ma'thur. I would add to that as-Suyuti's tafsir bil-ma'thur or tafsir al-ma'thur. I think it's a Durr al-Manthur fi tafsir al-ma'thur, which is also another one. I mean, I'm a Suyuti fan, so I would always recommend Suyuti's works. But of those, probably everyone knows Ibn Kathir. Ibn Kathir is a very standard, very stable, very reliable tafsir that does tafsir by narration, and we'll get into them right now. So these are ones that, if you want to look at the approach that the Mufassirun had by tafsir al-ma'thur, you want to consider these four. And in our discussion of them, as we will come to see, there will be some deficiencies or some room for improvement, let us say, for each of them. So the first one he wants to go through is Jam' al-Bayan al-Tafsir by al-Tabari, and he is, of course, the famous Mujtahid Imam who we met in the introduction to Shafi'i law course. I'm running out of time. Let me pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. So the first tafsir we want to look at is Tafsir al-Tabari, and he is the Imam Abu Ja'far Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Yazid al-Tabari. He was a Mujtahid Mutlaq. He was born in Tabaristan in 224 of the Hijrah, and he died in Baghdad in 310, rahimahullah radiyallahu anhu. So this is a very, what's the right word? This is like an encyclopedic tafsir, and he definitely brings together the narrations that he's talking about. He also does a lot of linguistic analysis of different grammatical points of how you understand the different verses. He also knew the qira'at, so there is a reference always to the different ways of reciting certain verses, and the different ways of reciting verses are also going to be tied to different grammatical positions on the i'rab of things. And then the main reason why we're talking about him is because he brings in the narrations. But he brings the narrations with the chain of transmission, so that's one of the tremendous advantages of the tafsir, but he does not provide the grade of the tradition. And one of the reasons that Shaykh Nuruddin Aitar, our author, rahimahullah, one of the reasons he says that he doesn't do that is that at the time that Tabari lived, I mean, he was the 3rd century, right? Yeah, the 3rd Islamic century. this was a very common, these narrations were very common, and people knew the veracity and the structure, the rating, the grading of the hadith. So it's sort of like a defense of why he didn't include them. That's probably true, but in all cases, if you're going to get a modern critical edition of a Tabari, you're going to find the takhrij of the hadith in there, so that problem is solved. And that's why you have to always look out for the best critical edition that will have in the hamish, in the bottom part, in the margin, you will find the takhrij. Okay, this hadith is Tirmidhi said it's this, Ibn Majah said it's this, or this is muttafaq alayhi, or this is in the Mu'jam of a Tabarani, or something like that. So that will be taken care of from the modern critical editions. The next tafsir is the tafsir of Ibn Kathir. Ibn Kathir was born in Damascus in the year 700 and died in 774. He is Imad al-Din Abu al-Fada Ismail ibn Amr ibn Kathir al-Basiri thumma al-Damashqi. Well known from the lineage of the school of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahumullah. So he is a favorite tafsir with Salafis and people that are Salafi leaning. But I mean, it's a good. That doesn't mean it's bad. It's a good tafsir because I mean, I use it all the time personally because it's tafsir bil ma'thur. You're going to find all of the major narrations in that. So he basically gathers the hadith from the well-known collections when he's doing tafsir of different verses. That's basically the whole book is like that. He has some grammatical comments, some linguistic comments as well, but mainly it's the ahadith. And it's one of those books that's published so frequently, so it's very easy to get. The third is Lubab al-Ta'wil fi Ma'ani Tanzil al-Khazin, and he is Ala al-Din Abu al-Hasan Ali ibn Muhammad ibn Ibrahim al-Shihi al-Baghdadi al-Shafi'i al-Sufi, and he is known as al-Khazin because he was the bookkeeper for the main library in Damascus. What a job. What an amazing job. He was born in Baghdad in, I don't know if I said his dates, but he was born in Baghdad in 678, and he died in 741. So mashallah, long life. And he is a tafsir al-ma'thur, but he removed a lot of the chains of transmission. So this is an example in which you'll just find, narration after narration after narration, and then the problem for you is, well, what is this narration? Is it sound? Is it not sound? Because sometimes we want to have a weak narration, and we want that to be our istidlal, weak narration, to show that this is a weak position or something like that, or it's like a latifa, it's like a subtle point. So there's nothing wrong with that, but I have to state that, or else the person or I'm going to get lost, and the people that are going to read my book are going to get lost. And then, like the book like the tafsir of Ibn Kathir, there are going to be a lot of critical editions of this around that people can rely on. And then number 4, Al-Jawahir Al-Hisan fi Tafsir Al-Quran Li-Tha'alabi, and he is Abu Zayd Abd al-Rahman ibn Muhammad ibn Makhluf Al-Tha'alabi Al-Jazairi Al-Maliki. He died in the year 876, close to 90 years old, and he's buried in Algeria, rahimahullah. And like the other ones, the same type of situation. It is a tafsir bil-ma'thur. And one of the challenges of his book is that, of his tafsir afwan, is that he did a lot of tafsir with sources that are no longer found with us. And that's also another problem that is not stated explicitly in the book, but I want to state it for you, is that we lose things. We lose sources over time. So somebody might be like, okay, I'm just making this up. Like Ibn al-Ghazali said such and such book, and then that version of the book, like, we don't have anymore. It's just lost. Or a Sakhawi had some kind of book and it just didn't make it. We just lost the manuscript. That's a problem, right? Because then we have no way of verifying it. So the reference of that becomes the only source that we have. It's the only proof that we have. We're not thinking that the sheikh lied, but we're just saying we have nothing to hold on, nothing tangible for us to hold on to, to verify the various things that we're reading. So losing sources and manuscripts over time is a real problem that can happen. That was the portion that I didn't want to get into the tafsir bil-ra'i, but I do want to go back, so we have a couple minutes, and I want to talk a little bit about something, just double down on something about this tafsir section. The Isra'iliyat, when you say the Isra'iliyat, it tends to be construed or interpreted as something negative. So I also want to kind of help us understand that term. It simply means traditions that come from the people of the book before us. Isra'iliyat, obviously, many of the traditions, in the case of what we're talking about, tafsir, come from from Jewish sources, not Christian sources. So that's why it's called Isra'iliyat. But it really, and obviously Christ alayhi salam was a Hebrew prophet, so that's sort of what the reference is. But anybody in the people before us that have to do with a story that is in the Quran, that tradition would be considered an Isra'iliyat. And as I said, the Prophet himself, ﷺ, narrated many Isra'iliyat. Like the famous story of the man who killed 99 men and wanted to find Tawbah, that's a story found with Bani Israel. It's not a story from Islam. So the Prophet ﷺ himself, ﷺ, narrated these things. So there's nothing wrong with narrating these things, because obviously when the Prophet ﷺ narrated a piece of tradition from the pre-existing people, it's sound. So that we accept. The issue here is the chain of transmission. The chain of transmission and that which is being transmitted. It has to be something that is 100% authenticated with our science of the chain of transmission, for us to be able to consider it. When we don't find a chain of transmission, or we find something dubious, then we have to look at it askance, and we have to decide, well, maybe we won't use it, maybe we can't use it. And that's what he was saying, that the person that's going to engage in tafsir has to be very, very aware of this. So you have to really know about the science of hadith nomenclature, chains of transmission, how to analyze if a text is sound or not sound. It's a very important skill set, so you don't get lost in the tafsir. So if you're going to look up an older tafsir, if you're going to grab an older tafsir for your references, my advice to you is you want to make sure that you have a critical edition that has all of the takhrij of the hadith and the traditions, so you can know what's right from what's sound from what's not sound. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam, wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, in today's class we were able to finish the discussion of the Meccan and Madanese verses. We looked at the themes that the Madanese verses cover, and then we looked at the style of the Meccan verses versus the Madanese verses, commenting that this is not like 100% hard and fast rule, but these are generalizations, and therefore they are descriptions, not prescriptive. We're not saying that a Meccan verse has to follow the scheme for it to be considered a Meccan verse, and vice versa for a Madanese verse. Rather, these are things that we deduce by analyzing large chunks of the Meccan verses and the Madanese verses. Then the next thing is we march into this new chapter, which is chapter 8, looking at tafsir, or ta'wil sometimes it's called. We looked at the definition of that very briefly, and then we said that there are two types of tafsir. There are tafsir al-ma'thur and tafsir bil-ra'i. Tafsir based on traditions and narrations, and tafsir based on independent reasoning. And today's lecture was focused on looking at tafsir al-ma'thur with narrations. We learned that there are three main problems to that type of tafsir. A large amount of Isra'iliyat appear. Oftentimes chains of transmission appear, and there have been forgeries that have happened in the past. So those are things that the ulama have to look out for in looking at those tafsir, so we don't get lost. And then he gave us a list of 4 tafsir in this genre: At-Tabari, Ibn Kathir's, Al-Khazin's, and Al-Thalabi. And we looked at those a little bit and made kind of like a light comment as we went around, went down the list. I added As-Suyuti's tafsir bil-Ma'thur as maybe a 5th one that one would want to look at. Probably the most famous and accessible for people is Ibn Kathir, followed by At-Tabari. But the point is that these represent excellent examples of tafsir al-ma'thur, and we looked at some of the deficiencies or some of the areas that could be improved, let's say, and those areas have been improved in those tafsir because we now have critical editions. You're rarely going to find a book of Turath now except that you have it through an editor or a critical edition to make sure that you're not going to get lost in these spurious narrations, forged narrations, false narrations, Israeliyat that don't count, so on and so forth. So those are the main topics we talked about. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.